This next guy, as I just thanked him, he was the one that brought in the 54th here tonight, and what an evocative poem again, Brenda. That was very, very evocative in that entire speech. Gerard, Emmett, Roberta, thank you very, very much. Tony. This guy here is the president of the Civil War Roundtable of Greater Boston. The CWRTGB has helped with educational efforts, graveyard desecration repairs. Unfortunately, that's becoming big business nowadays. And preservation of all historical sites, effects, and antiquities. He's a leading authority on military activity during the Civil War, the war between the states. He's also chairman of the Waltham Historical Commission, a huge New England pro sports fan. And tonight, he's portraying circa 1885 from the Boston Evening Transcript, Clarence W. Barron. I welcome David Smith.
Thank you very much. You'll just give me a moment. I have to make a slight change and adjustment here. I have to get onto my 19th century reading glasses. My very expensive 19th century reading glasses, by the way. So, got to be very careful about these. I am presenting myself to you tonight as a gentleman by the name of Clarence W. Barron. Mr. Barron, in the year of 1885, is a reporter for the Boston Evening Transcript. The Boston Evening Transcript is a real newspaper. I was a real reporter. The original Boston Evening Transcript was situated at the corner of 324 Washington Street and Milk Street in downtown Boston, and that building went down in flames in the Great Fire of 1872. Much of what I'll talk about tonight will be the contributions of all the New England soldiers, including the 54th Mass. And the ladies, and the great ladies. But we must talk about this now. This is now 20 years after the end of the American Civil War. To talk about the end of the Civil War, we have to talk about the beginning of the Civil War and pretty much what it was about. It was about a final abolition of slavery. A dreaded thing that was in this country for many, many years. Much about this whole thing has been written in newspapers and articles all over the place. I was glad to hear that a lot of the stuff that was written in poems was published in the Colonial Times and by one of my favorites, Anne Bradstreet. And also Mother Goose was doing some of her poetry that was published in the Boston Evening Post, which I also worked for, by the way. But we have to talk about the Civil War. The Civil War, 84 years after the American Revolution began, and I have to tell you, as I tell everybody all the time, at whatever program I do, in whatever persona I do that as, no one, and I say no one, ever thought when that thing started that it would turn out to be 4 years of bloody, savage, cruel, vicious, terrible, terrible war. As I always say, and in some of my programs, in February of 1861, when Jefferson Davis, as President of the Confederacy, and in March of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln, as President of the United States, were both giving their first inaugural addresses, neither man ever thought that this war was ever going to end up like that. Now, both were great men, brilliant men. Both had similar thoughts on the war and the reasons for it and why it should be fought when it was going to be fought. But if either man had ever thought it was going to end up the way it did, they never would have started it. They never would have allowed it. I know from all my readings of both these men that to be true. Neither man, with all their advisors and all their knowledge and all their experiences, and certainly Jefferson Davis is a great military man in the Mexican War, would have ever thought about doing that. He saw what war could do. He could see the sadness and the tragedy of war. So he, among else. From the beginning of the war in 1861 in April to the end of the war in April 1865, there were over 10,000 battles fought on American soil, all the way from New Mexico in the west to Virginia in the east, from Florida in the south to Vermont in the north. The South was a much more rural society. when the war began, relying mostly on its cotton, its rice, its oil, tobacco, some lumber. But it lacked great railroads. It lacked banking to supply the money that's necessary. And as a matter of fact, it lacked in virtually every resource a compatible asset with any of its neighboring Confederate states. The North, however, was much different. The North had everything. The North had better banking, which financed the war and continued to finance the war through the bankers and the industrialists on Lincoln's side for the next 4 years. The North had better farms going to supply the food they needed to supply their soldiers. The North had better machinery, made better guns, better uniforms, better shoes. And the one resource that the North had, ultimately, that was the difference in the war, that the South did not have and could not resupply itself with, was men. Roughly, by the time the war began to the time the war ended, the North had somewhere between 2 and 3/4 million men, possibly up to as many as 3 million men, women, and children. The South had somewhere between about 1.25 million to about 1.5 million or thereabouts. Difficult to know the South figures. Record keeping in the South was much, much more difficult. And especially after the war, we had little resource to grab the information that we needed. Much of what I've done as a reporter for the Boston Evening Transcript has been on the financial end of it, but I do have a slight interest in history. And of course, the reason I'm here doing this and doing this on history is because my editor told me to do that. And not being someone who's married right now, he's the only one I know of that can tell me what to do. I don't have a wife to tell me what to do. Yet. I will have, but not yet. So that's where we were. One of the problems with all of this is you have to remember that ultimately, out of all those millions of men that fought, and women and children, and we'll talk about the women and children later on, we would end up with approximately, again, record keeping is difficult, but approximately in the North, we would lose around 360,000 as casualties. In the South, we'd lose around 260,000 as casualties. About 1/3 in each category would die from shot and shell. About 1/3 in each category of North and South would die from disease, malaria, dysentery, things like that. And about 1/3 would die from other causes. When this is over, and it was a war of brother versus brother, just like the first American Revolution, let's not forget that. When it was over, in the first American Revolution, we were British citizens fighting British citizens on American soil. In 1861 through 1865, we were American citizens fighting American citizens on American soil and killing each other very, very nicely. We had the better armament, and we made some improvements to that. But we had one thing that was really bad: medicine. Medicine in the Civil War was terrible. Absolutely terrible. It was tragic. As a matter of fact, it caused many of the problems that we had, from the casualties that we had. The medicine that we used, the techniques that we used, created more problems. We used things like opium when we shouldn't have used it. We were supposed to be using another kind of drug. We didn't want to have opium or cocaine for that matter, or heroin for that matter. We had very little chloroform or ether in the battlefields of hospitals. And the South was even worse, by the way. Whatever I say about the North, trust me, the South is even worse. As a matter of fact, as a result of the Civil War, after the 615 or 20,000 casualties, you could probably add another 750,000 casualties that would become heroin and cocaine addicts as a result of the war. So that's where we are in 1865 at the end. And now 20 years later, we are here in a country that we basically wanted to have 104 years earlier, but not quite the same. The war was known by many, many different names in many different places. You have to remember that the Civil War was fought with northern names by the northern troops and southern names by the southern troops. In the South, they called it by the towns and by the rivers and streams. In the North, we called it by, different things. Different kind of geography, because we had maps. The South knew the land, so we were doing it differently. And like all wars, it would generate a lot of great firsts. We did develop better medicine as a result of the war, finally. We did develop a lot of other things. For instance, we finally found better artillery. We found a way to use balloons now to get the war seen differently, and spying became a better technique. And of course, we built better weapons to kill better, and we still do. Someone I heard today say we need a better gun law. I said, why? The guns we don't have right now aren't good enough, you know. But he was talking about something different. But the war was fought, and let's never forget this. Never forget this for 1 minute. We talked about the veterans. The war was fought by veterans, by men, young women, young children, on both sides, for reasons that they believed in, for a cause that they believed in. Let's not ever forget that. Right or wrong, whether you believe in what the South fought for or not, is not the point. They lost a lot, but they fought for something they believed in. And it cost them dearly too. But the war was fought by mostly young men and women and children from all over. Here in New England, we had some of the bravest, some of the best. And New England contributed greatly to the cause of the war, the fighting of the war, and the end of the war. We supplied a lot in farming, and we supplied a lot in the making of equipment and machinery, and the guns also. But we supplied the men that fought the war. And in 6 different states in New England, we have very little differences. In Rhode Island, and I can only name a few different groups, regiments, but they were all pretty much the same. And one of the things that wasn't mentioned, I will talk about when we get to Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, one of the more famous, if you want to call it that, would be the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry Regiment. They were all, for the most part, volunteer regiments, although eventually we got to drafting, and then there were also some bounties where you actually went into the war because someone paid you $300 and you took the place of someone else. But for the most part, it was volunteers, and especially here in Massachusetts and especially in New England. But Rhode Islanders from the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteer Infantry were one of the bravest. They fought in some of the most vicious battles of the war. Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. We've heard about these battles before. We've heard about the cost of the battles in terms of the men and the casualties. Rhode Island was no different. I have friends of mine in Rhode Island. I have friends of mine all over New England for that matter, but that's okay. Connecticut. This is going to be a short program, by the way. I'd like to do this program a full 45 or so minutes, but I'm only doing 12, I guess, or something like that. So, Connecticut also. 2 of the regiments they had over there out of the more than 20 regiments that they mustered into the cause of the fighting of the war were the 11th Volunteer Regiment Infantry and the 16th Volunteer Regiment Infantry, which was known as the Pilgrim Regiment. The 11th was known as their Irish Regiment. We had our Irish Regiment here in Massachusetts. In Vermont, where I have very many friends, and we talk about this all the time, Vermont was best known by the 2nd Vermont Brigade. The 2nd Vermont Brigade was headed up by a General George Stannard, and they were known primarily for what they did at Gettysburg. Gettysburg is a battle we all know and talk about, a place we shall visit, by the way. But there were a lot of brave men from all the states in New England that fought there and did valiant things. Stannard's brigade was the one that basically is given credit for flanking Pickett on July 2nd of 1863. July 2nd is known as the turning point of the war. By the time you get to July 3rd and his charge, you see, people think that's the end of the war, the turning point of the war. It's not. The war ended up months before that was the real turning point of the war, the real beginning of the end of the war, not Pickett's charge and certainly not Gettysburg. Stannard's brigade was very valiant, and Stannard would go down in history where they call Stonewall Jackson of the Confederacy. There goes Stonewall, standing like a stone wall. It was actually the Vermont people that are known as the real rock hard, stand them up and don't move any place and don't get back down kind of soldiers. And when I talk to my friends in Vermont, we always talk about that. Maine, to our north, which was once a part of Massachusetts, let's not forget that. Maine, to our north, is best known for the 20th Maine. 20th Maine, of course, led by Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. And Joshua Chamberlain at Little Round Top in July of 1863. On July 2nd, again, of 1863. We're going to talk a lot about July 2nd. One of the reasons I like July 2nd is that's my birthday. So, in 1855, I was born on July 2nd. So, we have a lot of famous July 2nds. But, of course, Chamberlain is best known for leading his men down the hill at Little Round Top with essentially empty rifles and beating back mostly the 15th Alabama and a few other Southern troops and turning the entire battle around. And again, people think that was the turning point of the war, but not quite. He will eventually be promoted, and eventually he goes on to becoming governor of Maine and president of Bowdoin College and everything else. Great man. One of our other neighbors to the north, New Hampshire. Again, all valiant men who suffered great casualties in all their battles and all their regiments, but their most famous regiment, and one that I have a particular affinity for in another persona in a future date and time, is a 5th New Hampshire Volunteer Regiment, led by a man named Colonel Edward E. Cross. Now, Colonel Edward E. Cross is a very strange man, a very strange leader. Like most great leaders, he's a tough guy. He's a disciplinarian. And they were all, in that war and other wars, you know, you can't be a nice guy and be in charge of a group of men you're sending off to die. You have to be really, really tough, and you have to do a lot of things and say a lot of things sometimes that nobody likes. Colonel Cross was a great example of this, but he was well respected. He was a man they knew would treat them fairly and treat them well, and a man that would stand with them and stand behind them in their times of trouble. And that's why they fought for him and they died for him as much as they did and as well as they did. Colonel Cross, on July 2nd of 1863, again, a few years after mine, but on my birthday, would start a charge on the wheat field, and before he starts the charge, he will be promised a generalship. Unfortunately, he would get shot and killed 2 hours later, and it won't be until 2005, in another persona, another time, that he will get that generalship, thanks to my Civil War Roundtable of Greater Boston and many people in New Hampshire. And a gentleman by the name of Harvey Griff, by the way, of my Civil War Roundtable of Greater Boston. Takes a while to move people in Congress to do things. And don't let anybody else tell you it's any different. Now, I will end shortly, because John's going to throw me off here pretty soon, with Massachusetts. And I can tell you a little bit about Massachusetts in this brief summary. We had almost 70 regiments formed, again, all volunteer. High among these 70 would be, of course, the 1st. The 16th, which came primarily from the city of Waltham, in another persona, another time, and some other people from the Historical Society there, and some of the people. The 20th, which is, of course, the famous Harvard Regiment. Oh, please, 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 go on. And the 28th, which is another great Irish. Yeah, I know. I hear that so much at all these encampments, reenactments, and whatever. And I go, okay, yummy, for the great Harvard Regiment. Okay. And of course, as we just heard about, the 54th and the 55th, which would follow the 54th. The great contribution of the 54th was to be the first of the great colored troops to form as a regiment and fight and die with great losses, which would eventually lead to about 200,000 black troops fighting for the North. The South, by the way, would get about 3,000 fighting in Louisiana of former slaves they decided finally to give a gun to defend themselves. But the 54th Mass, and again the 55th after that, but formed the basis for the 200,000 that would come and be a decisive factor in the final outcome of the war. What these wonderful people, what these great friends of mine forgot to mention, for whatever reason, one of the people they had in that regiment was a fellow named Sergeant Kearney. His relative is living down in was it, yeah. Wait a minute, it's down in the South Shore someplace. I forget where he's living now. I got to get in touch with him. Sergeant Carney, and if we look at this over here, this flag, this American flag, ladies and gentlemen, on both sides, that's what they fought for. Either that flag or their own version of the flag. And Sergeant Carney, who would receive the Medal of Honor, there's a poem called "The Flag Never Touched the Ground" for Sergeant Carney. But he was another one of those men. He was another gentleman by the name of Thomas Plunkett from the 21st Massachusetts, and his relative back there, who also had a similar situation. But this is what they were made up of. These were young men who were sons of printers, sons of merchants for the most part, sons of farmers that went off to these wars. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, before I conclude, we also had, in high numbers here especially, young ladies. Young ladies who fought in a uniform, like that young lady. Although they didn't have a young lady in a uniform at the 54th, but we did have them in many, many other units in the North and also the South, by the way. We've documented about 400, I believe, at this point, still working on it, who started off by following brothers or fathers or husbands and then eventually took up the uniform and the gun and went all the way with them. Many of them following on the heels of a young lady by the name of Deborah Sampson Gannett, who our Mother Goose also does, who did that in the American Revolution. Brave men, brave young ladies, and yes, some children. We have some children, age 10, that were buglers and, you know, whatever else, and young ladies too, by the way, at the age of 10 or 11. So this is what we had, and this is what it's all about. And as I ask you to do when you see a veteran today of any war, please remember to say thank you. The war ended. We did solve the one great crisis in our country, which was slavery. And very quickly we formed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which freed the slaves, the 14th, which made them all citizens, and the 15th, which gave former slaves, now citizens, the right to vote. Except only the male, former black slaves, now citizens, not the female, former slaves, now black citizens. That took another few years. Then all the women got the right to vote, black and white. But let's not forget that. That was a little thing nobody mentions in the study of history. Everybody says, oh, we had the right. Yeah, no. Just the male black guys. They kept it from their wives for a while. So, and Emmett, I'm going to tell your wife about that. So, I hope that this talk will give you some idea very quickly of what it was all about. And as I say, I can't emphasize enough that, you know, the people that fought on both sides were all for the most part very young, and they were all for the most part very ordinary, common soldiers. Very few were well-to-do and rich and famous. Robert Gould Shaw, yes, came from a very well-to-do family. For the most part, they were just, as I say, sons and daughters of farmers and peasants and storekeepers and whatever else. And it's not changed today as far as I know. And I would like to say thank you very much for your time. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be available afterwards.
Folks, one more round of applause to the most knowledgeable person regarding the Civil War, Mr. David Smith.
I'm not sure about the most knowledgeable, but after 30 years, I learned a couple of things, I think. Oh.
We get one quick question in, just